And good afternoon. My name is Sabrina Lamb, and I'm the founder and the executive director of the World of Money, a New York City based nonprofit dedicated to providing immersive financial education for children ages 7 to 18 and powered by the YWCA of Metropolitan Chicago. Happy Black History Month. But when we talk about Black history, often, which is really American history, we often ignore the financial efforts and the heroicism and the courageousness of African Americans, how they participated and aligned with this powerful currency called money. Well, today we have a very special guest for Money Talks at World of Money. And we are welcoming to the World of Money Money Talk stage Timothy Todd. He's the executive writer with the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. His seventh book, because Tim has been at this for a long time, his seventh book was entitled Let Us Put Our Money Together, the Founding of America's First Black Banks. Today, Tim joins us to talk a little bit about that and a lot about everything regarding Black banks to discuss his latest, his eighth book entitled A Great Moral and Social Force, a history of Black banks. And stay tuned because we have a gift for all of you. And also, if you have any questions during our conversation, please use the chat, whether on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter, because Tim is here to answer the questions that you may have. Welcome, Tim. Thank you so much for being with me.
Joining you today. Looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, so, all right, so everyone who's joining us, just get ready to take a trip because Tim, you're taking us through four cities in the US and using the backdrop of which is a lot of the time in the US history in terms of upheaval. You use the US history as a backdrop for African American banks and the launching of them, what their experiences were, and you talk about and you share, you research the discrimination, the segregation, the poll tax, the denial of voting rights, early gentrification. Could you share with us why you focused on Richmond, Virginia, and we're all going to these cities over the next hour, Richmond, Virginia, Foley, Oklahoma, Detroit, Michigan, Chicago, Illinois, and Memphis, Tennessee. Why did those locations resonate with you for this book?
So there's definitely other cities we could have looked at. Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., New York, all come to mind. What we were trying to do with this book is recognizing that, as you mentioned in your comments, a lot of this history is unknown to people and it's not been widely made available. And so what we were trying to do was present this in a way that would resonate with a lot of people, make it easily understandable. So we're not going to get into the economic world or the finance world, but looking at communities at key points in time where Black-owned banks were important catalysts of economic opportunity and growth. And so what we did is we decided one way to do this would be to move through history and then identify those cities that move or that align with particular points in time. So Richmond was really the dawning of Black-owned banks in the United States, and that happens after the failure of Reconstruction. So that's going to be in the late 19th century. And then from there, we move forward in time. So in the next time period, we focus on Oklahoma, and we can certainly talk about a town called Boley, Oklahoma, that was a significant town. A lot of people are probably unaware of. That happened around the turn of the century. And then after that, you had the increasing industrialization in the upper Midwest. So you had a large migration out of the South to Chicago, where they sought employment and jobs were more readily available. And then from there, really the next stage is the real sort of dawning of the civil rights era. And that happened in Memphis. And banks were hugely involved there. And then you sort of see the civil rights era continuing, sort of late stage civil rights era, later stage. I saw something the other day, someone said, we're still in the civil rights era. It's always the civil rights era. And I think that's a good way to look at it. But then we look at Detroit and kind of what happened there in the 1960s and later.
So let's dig in. But first, I thought it was really interesting in the book you shared that rather than having a profit motive for bank African American bank founders, it was really their motive of having public service. What do you mean by that?
So yeah, so one of the things that is interesting, and one of the things that I found when I looked at the very earliest banks, and then you see this continue through history, is, you know, people. So when you think of a bank, you know, it's obviously a business, and it's you know, it's there like any business to turn a profit. But what was interesting to me is that time and again, the people who founded the banks weren't sitting around saying, "Hey, here's a business opportunity." The way you might look at your neighborhood and think, you know, "Hey, we need a grocery store. I'm going to go open a grocery store because I can make some money here," right? So it wasn't that thought process. It was more of, we can help the whole community. We can create some opportunity in the community. We can help people save their money. We can lend money so people can buy businesses and do all those things. And that motivated them time and again, whether you're talking about Richmond in the late 1800s, or if you're looking all the way to what was happening in Detroit, even in the 1980s.
So Tim, but why are black banks necessary? Why are they important? Why are they needed?
Right.
Because
So
I feel, and I just want to say, just to use as a backdrop, I don't think that people are really getting, some are getting why they are necessary. So could you talk about why they are from an economic standpoint and how they shape and impact Black communities?
right. So early on, in these earliest banks that we talk about, you had a segregated economy, and that went on for decades in the United States. And so in some of the cities we talk about, for example, on the south side of Chicago, you had an economy that basically, you know, operated as an entity sort of its own there on the south side. That's obviously not the case today. Thankfully, you know, everyone does business with all kinds of banks and all kinds of businesses. But one of the things that the research shows, and you go and you start looking at the data, is you see that minority-owned depository institutions, is what they're referred to, are MDIs. And a minority-owned depository institution is a Black bank, but it's also a Native American bank, Hispanic American bank, an Asian American bank. Those banks are more likely to be located within what we call minority majority communities. So these are communities with large minority populations. They are more likely to be lending to families for mortgages, so helping people buy homes. They are key lenders in particular to small businesses. So entrepreneurship and business startup and keeping small businesses functioning. These banks are hugely important in that area as well. You know, obviously people can save their money with any bank, but these are the banks that are connected to the communities. And what's concerning, just to kind of continue the discussion a little bit, is that the number of Black banks in the United States has been declining slowly for the past 20 years. And the data shows that when a bank closes in a minority community, it is unlikely that another bank is going to go open a branch in that community. So that makes it all the more important and concerning.
So as I've said to everyone, Tim's latest book uses as United States history, civil rights, human rights history as a backdrop. So what made it? I don't want to use the word easier, Tim, but they were able. Founders in the as early as the 1800s, late 1700s, were able to launch banks. And why is it so difficult now?
So one of the things, and it's almost kind of a joke in the section where we talk about Chicago, someone points out, you know, at that time you could open a bank by literally painting the word bank on your window, and you were in business as a bank. And
Jesse
you know,
Vega,
right,
yeah, I wrote that, yeah.
right, and
And
you know,
he did open a bank that way.
he did open a bank, a successful bank that was stable and did a lot of good for the community. Unfortunately, not all banks, and I'm not speaking about Black banks here, all banks weren't as well run. And so you had a lot of bank failures and a lot of problems. People lost their money in banks. We went through the Great Depression. And so after that, there was a recognition that there needed to be more regulation and more of a safety net behind financial institutions so people weren't going to be wiped out.
Mhm.
And so that made it a little more difficult to create a bank, right? As far as the amount of capital that you need for that bank got much larger. The bank needed to be able to withstand a financial crisis. So you began to see these regulations form. It made it a little more difficult to start a bank. Certainly individuals did that and continued to do that, but it got a little more difficult than it was in the early days.
And the difficulty part, some was intentional and not really about regulation, but about discrimination, correct?
Well, right. So definitely, discrimination is a part of the story. And then when you think about creating a bank, remember that a bank lends money and it is a catalyst for economic opportunity in a community. But a bank, needs a strong community for the bank to be able to thrive also. So if the community is suffering, it's very hard for the bank to have those deposits that it uses to loan out to grow. And so you saw in the United States a large number of black banks created starting around 1900 up to the Great Depression. And depending on how you count, what qualified as a bank, probably somewhere between 60 and 100 black banks in the United States. By the end of the Great Depression, you're left with somewhere around 8. And that's a reflection of what happened in the communities where people were losing money. And then obviously, banks are going to get pulled into that as well.
And also with the absence of financial institutions, credible financial institutions in Black communities, often those communities have to rely on predatory services such as payday loans, check cashing, rent-a-center, title loans, and they continue to prop up and target these communities that do not have financial services.
Right. So those types of firms are what we refer to as alternative financial services providers, and they are.
Tim, that's a nice way of putting it.
I was going to say that may be a little bit of a nice way of putting it, but these are the kind of places that, they charge a very high, often exploitive rate of interest. In some parts of the United States, they're much worse than other parts of the United States, depending on how active the state is in regulating those firms. But the research has shown what I think all of us have observed who look around our cities, that these firms are more likely to be located in minority communities. And it really becomes problematic when you think about, just at the individual level. If you have a bank account and you are able to save money, that's going to help you in times of emergency. And so you think about, where I am in the United States, we're having a bit of some people call it a snowstorm. I don't think it's quite that bad, but we're having some winter weather today. And some people's pipes are going to freeze, maybe even, in my own neighborhood, and those pipes are going to rupture and that's going to do some damage. If you have a bank account and you save money, you're going to be able to hopefully, pay to get your home fixed or fix whatever damage you have, or even beyond that. If you, have a bank account, you're going to have a relationship with a banker. And so you may be able to go there and ask for a loan that's going to get you a far more favorable and fair, more importantly, interest rate than what you're going to get out of some type of payday lender who can really create a lot of problems for you over the long term in that situation.
It's amazing. And particularly with the, internet, a lot of these alternative services are doing business in states that it's illegal for them to do it, but they use the internet to leapfrog over state boundaries.
Yeah, so the internet, I think, and technology are interesting because I think there can be a good side and a bad side to the technology, right? So being able to reach more people can be good, but I think people need to be more vigilant as they deal with these businesses and look at some of the things we're seeing being innovated right now in the financial system. People really have to be careful and think about what they're doing. I think technology can open a lot of doors, but it also can leave you vulnerable if you're not really careful with what you're doing online.
So now often you hear many people talking about generational wealth. And I love the part in your book where you talked about William Pettiford, who launched his bank because he experienced or met orphans who did not have access to their parents' estate. Could you share that story, please?
Yeah, so William Pettiford created a bank in Birmingham, Alabama. He was a preacher down there, I believe at the 16th Street Baptist Church. And he recognized in the community, so at that time in Birmingham, you had an increase in industrialization. You had a growing Black population that didn't have anywhere to save their money. And so he believed very strongly that if you created a bank, people could save this money and then it could be loaned out to the community and create additional. he created the bank, but one of the things that really struck him was a story about a couple children who had been orphaned. And those children, after their parents died, their parents had accumulated some wealth. I don't think it was, a fortune, but certainly a significant wealth for them. And there was no way to pass that money to the children because no one within their extended family, so like an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent, was able to post a bond that was necessary. They didn't have the financial resources. And so that was one of the reasons that he felt it was important to create a bank to prevent situations from like that from happening. And we actually take the title of the book from that. Someone wrote about Pettiford and said, this makes clear that a bank can be a great moral and social force. And I thought that comment really resonated with what he was doing. And it resonated just across history, what you saw banks do time and again, whether that's in Memphis or the south side of Chicago or Detroit.
I love this story. Now we're in Virginia now because Mr. Pettiford was in Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama. Let's go over to Virginia and all of that work, particularly done by Maggie Lee Mitchell. And I love the quote in your book where she said, quote, when any of us girls is advanced to making $50 per month, we begin to persuade her to buy a home. And as soon as she saves enough, the bank will help her out. This was in 1903. Tell us about Maggie Lena Mitchell.
So first of all, one correction, her last name is Walker. Maggie
Walker. Sorry, Walker.
John Mitchell was another banker
right,
in Richmond at that time. So Maggie Walker is an amazing individual. Some people may have heard the name. They may not know why. She was, I think without question, the most prominent female banker in the United States for a good chunk of American history. She was involved with an organization that was called St. Luke's, and she created St. Luke's Penny Savings Bank. And basically that bank St. Luke's became an organization that did all sorts of things. So it had some businesses going on that it operated. It did a lot of charity work. And she was really engaged in helping people improve their living condition, improve their living standards and the opportunities they faced. And so she was very active in making sure that people who worked for her and that she engaged with were going to be able to take advantage of those opportunities. And so again, this is another case where you see a bank that's not just interested in making a profit or making a strong business case, is really more of a community uplift type of thing. She's really a phenomenal individual. If you have an opportunity to get to Richmond, Virginia, you can tour her home, which is amazing. They have a visitor center there. It's a National Historic Site. Her bank and some of the others, there were actually 5 banks in Richmond around that time, anchored a very dynamic area known as Jackson Ward in Richmond that was well known by many people, an amazing, thriving Black community at that time.
So we're still in Virginia, and I'm joined by Timothy Todd, an executive writer with the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, regarding his newest and his 8th book called A Great Moral and Social Force, a History of Black Banks. Staying in Virginia, often when we talk about economic boycott, it's always the Montgomery boycott, 365 days, where many African Americans walked to boycott and not want to economically support that local mass transportation system. But that happened actually earlier, decades and decades earlier in Richmond, and 4 Black banks financed an alternative transportation system because they were boycotting the Virginia Passenger and Power Company. Tell us about that, Tim.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I was certainly interested to learn about, is that, as you mentioned, you hear a lot about the bus boycotts, but there was actually a similar issue with streetcars that happened much, much earlier. Richmond was one of the places where that was a very significant issue. And it's kind of interesting to sort of think about this really as sort of the precursor to what we saw later, and you see some of the same things. And so what happened there is you had that similar discrimination on public transportation, and then the banks really stepped up and tried to figure out, how can we work around this? Can we create something for the community that if we pool all of our resources, that we won't have to rely on this other system? And again, this is a place where it really speaks to that community leadership role. It was so so much a part of the fiber of these early banks. And they're sort of looking at the community, looking for places where they saw need, and then how could they, because they had access to the resources, how could they step in and make an important difference?
And right now in New York, in different parts of the country, there is political gerrymandering, redistricting, and so forth. That happened as well as, that's why Jackson District was created. That happened then as well. Could you share with us about that aspect in Richmond, Virginia?
Yeah, so there's, so without getting into all the details of how the government system was created in Richmond, that ward was basically created and its boundaries were created to be primarily a Black district because that's where African-American families lived. It was not necessarily, it wasn't shaped, it didn't have like a square shape, it had sort of a shoestring shape. You can go there even today, and if you just sort of walk around and know where those boundaries were, you can really get a feel for how it was kind of spaced out. So that's how that district came to be. It was a political process that drew that district because there was significant Black population in other geographic regions of the city, and it was sort of putting them all together in that one ward or voting district.
And we're taking your questions, everyone. And we have a question in the chat from David Youngblood. He writes, to what extent can or does the U.S. Treasury use African-American private equity owners and banks with taxpayer dollars to invest? Who gets to invest taxpayer dollars?
So, first, I need to say that I'm part of the Federal Reserve and we're separate from the Treasury. So just to make that clear. So I'm not privy to nor involved with how Treasury makes their deposit decisions and where they put their funds. Related to that, what I can say is there's a program that started, I think around 1970 called the Minority Institution Deposit Program or something like that encourages government entities to deposit their funds with minority-owned depository institutions. So this could be, your local government. Where do they deposit their money? In some cases, this, in the past at least, has been, the local post office. Where do they deposit their money? So there are initiatives in that area. I'm not involved nor up to speed on kind of where those things stand today.
Got it. Could you point David to any additional resources where he could source that out?
Yeah, I would go online and look at the Treasury's website and look for their minority program. I am sure that they are pretty active in that area, and I would think that information about those programs and those deposits would be available there.
And David, I would also check with the congressperson, the chair of the Financial Services Committee with the U.S. Congress. I'm sure they have their information, or that the staff members can provide you with that research. Yona, she writes, this information needs to be shared with our communities. Absolutely, Yona. So let's go to Oklahoma, Tim.
Yeah. So
let's go to Bola, Oklahoma.
So yeah,
Go ahead.
No, so one of the things that this is another part of American history that I think I'm learning a lot of people aren't aware of. I grew up in rural Kansas, and so I was a little bit familiar with this history because we had the same thing in Kansas also. But after the Civil War and formerly enslaved individuals are emancipated, they basically have a few options available to them, right? So some go to the northern U.S. to seek economic opportunity. Some are going to stay in the South and work on the farm. Some are going to stay in the South and go to cities, places like Atlanta or New Orleans. But there was sort of another alternative that some people pursued, and that was to move to the U.S. Plains. And you see there where they established communities in Boley, Oklahoma. This is Pecan Street in Boley, Oklahoma. They created small towns across the American Plains, and the idea was that these were Black communities. So the idea was they were completely, everything about them, from the government structure to all the businesses, were owned and operated. All the residents were Black Americans. And so Oklahoma, partly because of its proximity to the South, but also because it was a territory and not a state, so it had some different issues with land ownership. Oklahoma was actually home to 50 all-Black communities that were created during this time. I grew up in Kansas. Kansas had some also. Most famously in Kansas was Nicodemus, Kansas, which some people may have heard of. It was fairly prominent. That was in western Kansas, and then you also had some in Nebraska and parts of Colorado as well. But Boley, Oklahoma, was really a well-known community on a national scale, and was really sort of held up as a shining example of what a community could be. And so it had a number of businesses. It had a very large building. It had a 3-story building that at the turn of the century was considered the largest building in eastern Oklahoma. I think it had 80 some businesses early in the 1900s. It actually, for a time, had 2 banks and then briefly 3 banks. The first nationally chartered Black-owned bank in the United States was actually in Boley, Oklahoma. So there's a very rich history there of a community that was very vibrant and well-known. There you see that's Farmers and Merchants Bank there of Boley, Oklahoma. The bank president standing, Mr. Turner, standing on the front step there. Some people have heard of Boley. There's a story that comes around every so often about this bank was actually robbed by, if you've heard of the gangster, I guess Pretty Boy Floyd, one of his associates robbed that bank. So that story gets some attention from time to time, and it's unfortunate that people focus on that story and not really the story of a very vibrant, bustling, growing community for that time, sort of before industrialization, a heavy agricultural economy, and sort of those types of things that are going to sort of prevent Boley from recognizing its potential as people begin to move to larger cities for factory jobs, the type of jobs that Boley was just unable to provide.
Taking your questions for Tim Todd. Please put them in the chat, whether you're on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter. I'm fascinated by that whole so-called migration. That's kind of an easy word. A lot of African Americans left the Deep South to escape persecution to move to Oklahoma to form these 50 all-Black towns. There was a quote in your book saying that they wanted to move there, or they moved there because there was a land where they were free and their rights were respected. And a bank was formed to fund these Black homesteads. Tim, could you talk about that in the West?
So the creation of a bank there is very interesting in that where you saw banks created in other communities, you often had a connection. So in Birmingham, you had a connection to a church, for example. And some of the banks in Richmond, the Maggie Walker Bank is connected to another organization that is doing work in the community. But here in the West, you're creating banks that are basically reliant on that community, and they're going to lift up that community. So it's a little bit of a taller order. You don't really have that organizational safety net to fall back on. And so that was very key in bringing business and individuals, families, all those things that are needed that make a community a community. The banks were really at the heart of that, and really these communities don't develop without those banks. It just simply doesn't happen. And I'd like to double back too, because you are exactly right when you talk about, migration is kind of a nice way of putting it. We cannot overlook that if you were a Black banker in Richmond, Virginia in 1890, or you were, anywhere else, largely in the United States for much of this history, you were at significant physical risk. And high-profile individuals who were running banks probably faced even more physical risk. And so we talk about that in the book. It's a painful history, but it's important, I think, for people to understand that I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that some of these early bankers were very heroic in the risk they were willing to take.
And in your book, Booker T. Washington was quoted regarding Boley as the most enterprising and notable Negro town in the United States. Let's pivot to this history that I'm going to have to do more research on myself. The relationship between formerly enslaved Black people and the Native Americans, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creeks, and the Seminoles. That was a complicated relationship. And how does that connect with Black banks and economic prosperity?
Right. So Oklahoma in particular has a very rich and dynamic history of all types of diversity. I think more than many people would understand if you haven't really become engaged with it. it's very complicated to sort of get into the different Native American tribes after they were forced along the Trail of Tears out of the east and into Oklahoma territory. Some of them, they were Southern tribes, and some practiced slavery, although slavery has a wide range of definitions, and you know, I don't want that to be misconstrued, but it was handled a very different way depending on how the tribe was structured. From what we think of as more traditional to maybe more, I don't even know how to really describe the differences. And so that allowed for access to some of the land because you had that Native American culture and that Native American bloodline for some individuals and families. There is a book written by a professor from UMass. Her name is Barbara Krauthamer, and it is one of the sources we use for the book. And she actually worked with us on this book. So I would go out and look for Barbara Krauthamer's book. I can't remember the title. I actually have it at my office and I'm at home today. But her book is a very good resource in explaining how the relationships in that intersection of Native American culture and Black culture came together in the United States. She's a real expert on that issue.
Right. Well, in your book, you mentioned that the Choctaw and the Chickasaw kind of aligned themselves with the mindsets of the Confederacy, and the Creeks and the Seminoles were kind of liberal. But how did you weave that in terms of Black banks?
So as far as, you know, I guess I'm a little, I don't know, it's a little difficult to explain as far as the question, but it's definitely an important part of it, and sort of understanding the community and the landscape and all the things that were going on at that time in that place. It's a very complex intersection of different cultures. Yeah. And it's hard to, I feel like I'm going to open a huge discussion that may derail us here a little bit, just because, and we have to spend some time in the book, a significant amount of time actually explaining it. Because people sort of need that background to really understand how the community formed and how it evolved.
It's a fascinating information. Absolutely. We have a couple of questions in the chat, because now we want to go over to Greenwood. So Yona asked, what are your thoughts on the Black-owned online banks? Do they support the community? And then have questions from Corey Willis.
Yeah, so talking about the online banks, I think we are still figuring that out a little bit. I think the potential is there. You know, I am sort of at heart a believer that it's very important to have a physical presence in a community if you're really going to understand the needs of that community. And there's sort of that sort of extra effect, right? So an online bank, you know, you can open a bank account pretty much anywhere in the United States if you go online, right? And you want to do that. But a bank in a community, I think, is going to understand more the needs of the community. So that's going to get back to how do you borrow money? Where's that money come from? And what are those loans being used for? And sort of understanding that. If you have a local entity there, it's going to know, for example, that, hey, you know, we don't have a good restaurant in this neighborhood and someone wants to open a restaurant, they're going to know that. Whereas on an online presence, if the bank is located somewhere else, they're maybe not going to have that same understanding. So they may be looking at more sort of standardized lending metrics and just say, well, here's the numbers, and they're not really going to be able to weigh that community need, or maybe even the characteristics of the individual who wants to borrow money as far as, you know, their experiences in the community.
Thank you. And Carrie Willis, he writes, the M&F was located in the thriving business and residential district in the Hayti district of Durham, anchored by what became known as Black on Wall Street. What are your thoughts about that? Yeah,
so there's definitely...
Also, one more thing, it's a two-part. Let's not forget, he writes about the M&F Bank, formerly Mechanics and Farmers Bank, that was founded in 1907. Currently, it is the second largest minority-owned bank in the United States.
Right. So we didn't. Obviously, the banks that we talk about are not, thankfully, the only communities that had black banks through history. And so basically what we were trying to decide is to look at, sort of how can we move through history in a way that sort of keeps this on a narrative that's going to appeal to a large audience, right? We didn't want to write something that was heavily academic or would get tied up in the economics. We want to bring people in to learn this story who maybe aren't as familiar with banking and sort of bring them into the fold of understanding.
Got it. So let's go mosey over to Tulsa and
Sure.
Greenwood. You're the first researcher, this book, that pointed out a glaring omission when we talk about the story of Greenwood. Talk about the banks and how many people unfortunately lost their lives, how they're still not really being honored economically, the descendants. There was no black bank there.
Right. So this was something
Wait a minute, Tim. That's a big deal.
That is a big deal. And that surprised me. And we spent significant time making sure we were right about that before we wrote that, including, this was during COVID when we were doing this research, but we actually reached out and had people who were involved in historical work there, different organizations in Tulsa, and they actually went back through city business directories and business logs, cross-checking addresses and neighborhoods just to see, is there something we're missing here? And so that often catches people off guard, certainly did me. So to understand that, banks in the United States, no matter where we are talking about them, historically, most banks have been created in places where people don't have access to money. And so that means that the banks are created, or access to credit. They aren't able to borrow money. And so usually they have very little money. So they begin to pool that money together and then lend it out to the community. And so this goes all the way back to colonial New England. This has happened time and again in U.S. history. The Greenwood community in Tulsa was created in a very different fashion. And there's a couple things that make it very different than a lot of communities in the United States. There was significant wealth and good paying oil field jobs for everyone at the time Greenwood was shaping up. So that's at the time it was developing and it was population was growing. A lot of people were employed. Tulsa also for a time was much more welcoming to the idea of integration than some other communities were. And so there were Black individuals and families who had accounts with established white banks in the city. That was not, I don't know that it was the norm, but it wasn't completely unusual or as unusual it was in other cities. So that's also part of it. And then you have a couple developers come in who really develop the Greenwood community, and they have a lot of wealth. And so what you have developing Greenwood are a number of private lenders. And so not just among the founders, but then others come in, you have this money available. So it's a little different model in creating a financial system than what you're going to see almost anywhere else in the United States at that point in history. So the availability of money leads to a different economic model. That community grows, becomes incredibly vibrant and dynamic, and then it meets a horrible, tragic end. And one of the things that really stuck with me is that as the press reported this nationally, and they said people wanted to send donations, and where would they send donations? They actually sent them to Little Boley, Oklahoma, which was like an hour or so drive away, because that was the nearest bank that could handle this task. So definitely an interesting part of U.S. history, and certainly do not want to take anything away from Greenwood and what a phenomenal community that was.
Absolutely, but it's a huge part of the story, and I'm so glad that you included it. Let's go up to Chicago, Illinois, with a story of Jesse Binga. And please, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat, no matter where you are. Jesse Binga.
Yeah. So Jesse's an amazing individual. So he is really, that sort of self-made man. He shows up in Chicago around the time of the World's Fair and basically sets up a little stand there and starts going into business. His family was from Detroit, where they had been involved in real estate. And so he learns a lot about not just the real estate business, but how do you take care of real estate? How do you, repair the plumbing when something goes wrong, or keep the electrical working, or what have you. And so he becomes eventually involved in Chicago real estate, and he's very successful in part because he's able to do all that repair work himself. helped some other people who have real estate by doing repair work for them and doing some building management type functions. Eventually, he accumulates a pretty good amount of money out of his business, and it's going to lead him into banking again in the early 1900s. And then he's really becomes a banker. Basically just describes part of what he was doing there. So you have significant racial violence there. And he is really at the center of making sure, like even things, he works to even make sure groceries are being delivered to the neighborhood at a time when people weren't traveling into the neighborhood or were afraid to because you had a lot of violence erupting. He does a lot of things where he even goes and there are families attempting to move or buying homes in what had previously been all white neighborhoods, and they run into racial violence, and he goes and comes right down to the house scene where this is going on, and he helps the families. So he really goes sort of above and beyond what you think of as a banker, just to really lead a community through some really difficult experiences. It plays a very important role there.
Could you share a little bit about the Hunter Banking Company?
Yeah, so there were three banks in Chicago around the time that there was violence there in I believe 1919. And so a couple of those banks actually end up going out of business. They had been formed in 1917 and 1918. And they, at the time that you have this violence erupting, a number of people who lived on the south side of Chicago may have been unbanked, or they had accounts with banks in other parts of the city. So Chicago at that time has some of the biggest banks in the world in the loop. And so people who were in the neighborhood did not feel safe leaving the south side to go and get their money. And so Hunter and another bank and Binga to a degree, they began basically providing people with money to help them, feed their families and pay their bills and do all that type of thing, basically lending to them without knowing if those people are even going to be able to repay that or what money they might have in a bank account somewhere else. So again, this is a case where you see a bank putting itself out in a community leadership position. It's eventually going to create problems for Hunter because they're going to end up extended, and then there's going to be a turn in the economy. All this is sort of going to come crashing down around the same time. So it ends up being a tragic story, but I think it's also one that shows the sacrifice that takes place at a time when someone needed to step up financially.
Thank you. And while we're in the Midwest, let's go over to Detroit. What was your favorite, most impactful story or experiences coming out of that research in that city, with the backdrop of the Ford company and all the employment, and then losing that company? Talk about Detroit. Yeah, so Detroit is a very interesting city in a lot of ways, and I think there is I don't know, people sort of look at Detroit as it's a unique situation. And in some ways it's unique, but in some ways it's reflective of a lot of the rest of America, almost in microcosm too. And so there you had Henry Ford, who has his views on race are I think well known and disturbing, but also, he paid his employees relatively well and created economic opportunity. So it's a very complex story with him. But Detroit was a key point for Black individuals and families, again, on the Underground Railroad. And so there's a very rich history there because it was a jumping off point to get across and into Canada, just across the water from there. And so there's a long history there. But there's a lot of things about Detroit that I think are really interesting and kind of fun. If you look at Don Davis, who ran a recording studio there and worked with Aretha Franklin and all sorts of people. And he recognizes an opportunity and a need, and he gets in banking in 1980, says that the recording artist had run him out of the studio, that he needed to go do something else with his time. And one of my favorite things about him is the first recording. He started as a guitarist, and he replayed it on the song Money, was actually his first sort of big break as a guitarist. And so I think it's kind of neat that he had that connection in his life, and just a very interesting individual and a very interesting story. Joined by Timothy Todd. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Would love to hear from you. In the short time that we have left, let's go down to Memphis. And I love the story of Wayne Cox and how the Memphis Tri-State Bank merged with Liberty Bank in New Orleans. Do I have that story accurately? Love to, yeah.
Yeah, so that merger's going on. I don't know that it's been completed yet, but it's in the works right now. Liberty Bank, people can learn a lot about Liberty if you go back and you look at the archives of the New York Times and you look at what Liberty Bank did around Hurricane Katrina, which probably for some of the audience is going to feel like a long time ago, not so long for some of us. But they did a lot of that same type. Liberty did a lot of the same type of things we were talking about in Chicago with providing money to the community at a very difficult time. And then you have, of course, the Cox family and some of the stuff in Mississippi that they were involved with. And then you see the stuff that happened in Memphis with the creation of Tri-State Bank. Tri-State is actually the bank pictured on the cover of the book, and a very important institution in the civil rights era. So they did a lot of work. Some of their employees were involved in some of the landmark cases to expand civil rights. They did things like operate at extended hours during times of protest or activism because people were being arrested for going out and demonstrating. And so they would help bail people out. They would provide funds for that. Any number of meetings to plan a demonstration were held in Tri-State's offices. They did a lot of work. Also, there was an economic freeze that some businesses tried in that region in Mississippi to prevent Black businesses and families from being able to borrow money, or in some cases try to foreclose loans on them. And Tri-State was engaged in trying to provide credit to those families at a time of emergency. So again, it just keeps repeating that same sort of thing of, this important community leadership at difficult times on major issues. And I think one of the things people who read this book will be surprised by, even as much as we've talked about it, is how many events and things about from other aspects of U.S. history these banks touch on. Martin Luther King, Dr. King in Memphis, and you see the bank there with him. The last speech he gives, he's actually talking about Tri-State Bank. And so, there's a lot of connections to U.S. history, and that was one of the things we really wanted to do, is not just talk about these banks as sort of isolated financial institutions, but talk about them as part of a community and a broader landscape in the United States.
Just amazing. So we're about to wrap up, but before we do, could you share the perspective of Andrew Bremer, who he was and his perspective? He's African American. His perspective on the relevance of Black banks.
Yeah, so Andrew Bremer was a member of the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors. He was African American. He made some comments. Unfortunately, I think his words got twisted initially when he talked about Black banks, but he raised an issue that I think, as we look forward and we start talking about solutions, that I think remains relevant in a way today. And that is that many of these banks, there are about 20 African American banks still in business today. They are small banks. And so they can make a big difference in their community, obviously, and we've talked about that. But when you start talking about the world more broadly, and we start looking for equality in communities that don't have those banks, sort of how can we achieve that? And so I think the issue he was trying to get at, it got a little misconstrued, is that other very large banks, the banks that have since become known as too big to fail, is there a way to get those banks to do more within these communities that need the help, is what he was trying to say. And I think the press kind of jumped on some things he said at that time and kind of spun it a little bit out of control.
The press jumping on things?
The press does that. But, I think, but related to that, I will say, I think, as we think about what can other banks do, all banks, not just talking about banks that have Black ownership. And I think there is a real need for all of us, and I'm including the Federal Reserve, everybody in banking and financial services. How do we bring more Black workers into the financial services system for employment? How do we get more people employed in jobs in banking and financial services? And then how do we, how are we able to expand better into those communities? I think that's something that one of the issues that people really need to pay attention to. And then also bringing into the banking industry. I think, when you think of a banker, what kind of image comes to mind? I sort of joke that it's like the guy from the Monopoly board, right? Like you see the guy with like a top hat and a monocle or whatever. But we really need to think about people who are motivated out of a spirit of community service. And how can we bring those people, regardless of race, into banking and then teach them that stuff about loans and regulations and financing? I believe all that can be learned. I think you got to look at someone's heart, what motivates them, what drives them, what gets them excited in the morning. How do you bring those people who are motivated by helping the community into banking? I think it could have a big impact.
Well, Timothy Todd, calling you Timothy because your mother would appreciate that.
Oh, yes.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for dedicating time and resources and for this very, very important research. And Timothy Todd has a very important gift for all of you. How can everyone get your book?
Yeah, you go to the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City's website, kansascityfed.org, and you can order a copy of the book for free. We make this research available to anyone who wants it. You can go out there and you can download the PDF if you want to read it electronically, or you can request a book and we will put it in the mail for you. That includes the current book, The Great Moral and Social Force, and then also the book about the first banks, Let Us Put Our Money Together. We are more than happy to share those as an educational resource. I will tell you, we're a little bogged down in trying to get the printing, so it may be a few weeks as they're cranking these out as fast as they can. But if you go there, there's a form you can fill out, and we'll be more than happy to send it to you.
Everyone, grab the link or write it down, a free PDF or hard copy of the book. Go to kansascityfed.org. And for all of you parents, before we go, World of Money, we are registering online as well as in person for our 17th annual Youth Financial Education Training Institute. Just go to worldofmoney.org for complete information. Timothy Todd, thank you so much for joining us. He is the executive writer with the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. His latest book is A Great Moral and Social Force, The History of Black Banks. Thanks so much, Timothy. Be well.
You too. Thank you.